Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress is heading into the Easter recess with DHS still unfunded and no clear path to a deal. The president's move to ensure TSA agents continue getting paid may buy time, but it doesn't resolve the broader standoff or the demands piling up behind it. Loren Duggan of Bloomberg Government joins me with the latest read on where things stand and what's likely to move or harden during the break. Loren, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Last week ended with some fireworks on Capitol Hill that kind of continued into the weekend. So walk us through what happened and where we are today regarding funding for the Department of Homeland Security.
So DHS remains in its partial shutdown, and there was this burst of activity on Friday. Very early in the morning Friday, the Senate passed a bill that would have funded everything except ICE and parts of CBP, which were two of the key components in immigration enforcement. That arrived in the House, which over the course of the day, Republicans there rejected that approach and instead sent back a 60-day full funding CR for the entire department. But that now awaits in the Senate, which is already left for recess. And then the House followed them out the door late Friday night. So what we have is a standoff. We're still, have an unfunded department, except for where there's money from other sources like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed last year. But no resolution really in sight, with the two chambers, at least for now, scheduled to be out for a 2-week recess.
The president did sign an executive order last Thursday directing the Department of Homeland Security to pay members of the Transportation Security Agency. So their paychecks should start rolling out this week. But that doesn't solve the bigger problem across the department.
It doesn't. And, it was a memo that came, I think, as you said, to the Department of Homeland Security, and they're going to find funding that's related to TSA and use that to pay the TSA workers. So they'll have paychecks, and ICE and CBP have largely had paychecks as well because of the money that's been flowing through. That means that the TSA agents who weren't being paid were side by side with ICE agents who were, when some of them were deployed to airports last week. So that will be the case for now. It might take a little bit of the pressure off, but those long lines, we still saw some of those over the weekend at some airports, and I think the pressure will still be there to do something about this.
The language that both chambers were using as they left on Friday was no compromise. How do they get this to closure even when they get back?
It's a good question, because what the Senate passed felt like a compromise. It was passed by unanimous consent, which meant any one senator could have stopped it. There were only a few on the floor when they actually did the processing of it, but it went by UC and went forward. In the House, we saw that it was a pretty party line affair there. So they're going to have to get back to the table. This could reopen the discussion, by the way, about some of those changes to immigration enforcement policy, which the version that the Senate had passed, by leaving ICE funding out of it, there were no new conditions placed on ICE officers or others doing immigration enforcement. So we'll have to see if that comes back as a dynamic when they reopen these talks, because once you put that funding back in, that might be part of the conversation.
There's another big issue that's out there for them when they get back from recess, which of course is support and funding for ongoing combat ops. 2 weeks of recess, who knows what will happen in the operations in that time frame, and more troops are headed in that direction. So what are members saying now? What are they going to be looking at when they get back?
Well, there is still a lot of concern on Capitol Hill about what's happening. There have been briefings, and there are questions about what a $200 billion, which was the number that I guess the Pentagon was sending to the White House. We'll see what they actually send up to Capitol Hill, but they'll be looking at that very closely to see what's in it and what that would entail. There was some concern last week among members about going away for 2 weeks and what might happen operationally. Ground troops has entered the discussion as a possibility, not necessarily the plan, but members wondered, if we're gone for 2 weeks, what might that mean with a dynamic there, with some members saying, should we be talking again about authorizing what's going on in Iran? Not that they did so before they left, as we saw, but Iran is definitely going to be hanging over all this, both monetarily and operationally, when people get back in a couple of weeks. And of course, they'll be monitoring it from home and probably hearing about it from their constituents in their states and districts.
I'm speaking with Loren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Loren, what impact will this recess and these two big issues, Homeland Security and combat ops, what impact will all of that have on the rest of the unfinished business that is setting on the agenda for members of Congress?
Well, certainly we're looking toward a fiscal 2027 appropriation season. We've got to get the next series of bills before October 1st. Even if they don't finish them by then, they'll want to get to work on that. And a big monetary supplemental in the form of Iran or whatever else rides with that will be feeding into that. But there's a lot else on the agenda. They have been talking about doing a highway bill this year. They've been talking about tackling the FISA or surveillance authorities that run out right when they come back from recess. And that just adds to the plate that they have to deal with in that first week they're back in April. So there's a lot still on the agenda and a lot unfinished. The Save America Act, which we've talked about before, was on the floor for a couple of weeks. Presumably will still be on the floor when they come back, and we'll have to see how they approach that.
Well, let's dig into some of those 2027 funding questions in detail, because the president has said he will send his budget up to the Hill on April 3rd. That's a couple of months later than it's supposed to be, but I think people are like, well, great, at least we'll have one to look at. And OMB Director Russ Vought is scheduled to testify shortly after the members of Congress get back from recess. What will you be watching for that? What are you expecting?
We'll be watching to see in general. There were deep cuts proposed last year, and Congress went along with some cuts, but not as deep as the administration wanted. So what will this request look like? Would it hew closer to the level of cuts that were enacted or go deeper again? What does he do about the education department that he's talked about dismantling? Will there be a $1.5 trillion request for defense, as was suggested earlier this year as perhaps the goal for the administration? So we'll be looking to see broadly what those numbers are, and then some of the individual agencies, what they seek there, some of the things they want to prioritize this year. What do they say about Homeland Security funding? And do they make another request for a reconciliation style bill that would be outside the regular process as maybe a way to solve some of the thorny issues? And maybe the Republicans will go along with that on the Hill to try and get those things through without needing 60 votes.
Might this be an opportunity to revisit that ever popular topic of impoundments? It doesn't seem like the administration is going to be spending all of their 2026 appropriations by the time Mr. Vought gets up there to testify.
I'm sure there will be questions about that. The so-called pocket rescissions at the end of the year that some folks were concerned about last year. Maybe we'll see if that is an issue again this year. But Vaught's testimony will be closely watched. Democrats will have a lot of questions for him, certainly, and maybe some Republicans as well.
On top of all of that, there's new energy to the conversation about a reconciliation bill for 2027. Where is that conversation headed?
I think it has some renewed energy, in part because of this Homeland Security issue, in part because the president in general is very down on the filibuster and wants Republicans in the Senate to blow that up to get his priorities through. But with some of the funding questions before them, whether it's the money for Iran or the money for DHS, particularly ICE and CBP, and maybe some of these election questions they've tried to do in the Save America Act, there's talk about moving that over as well. And then some discussion about, do we go after fraud in programs or look for improper payments, things like that. So both parties would have goals. It's going to be a very narrow path to get through, given the slim majorities, but that might be their best way to get some of these funding things resolved without needing 60 votes in the Senate.
And Loren, the recess isn't really a time when no work is getting done. People are still on the Hill. Staffers are still working. What are you going to be tracking over the next couple of weeks to tell you maybe which way the wind is blowing when the members are back in session?
Certainly what the budget says will be big because that'll be part of the discussion. But then what is done on FISA? Are there announcements made over the next couple of weeks? Because that's as much a party management as a policy question. How does Mike Johnson craft a bill to get that through his House, given some of the procedural difficulties? So they might release something early on so people have time to digest it. Certainly in the couple of days before they come back on April 13th, we'll be looking to see what they're scheduling for the week ahead and what's kind of coming to light, because maybe there will be something agreed in principle before they come back. But as you said, people work the phones, people hop on Zoom calls. They don't stop working just because they're not in Washington. Loren
Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Loren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from CBS News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.